And if you read it, Ezekiel 37, all the way through really these passages, you get this staged fulfillment of this restoration prophecy. And it seems to imply that first he's going to bring the nation back into the land, and then he's going to sprinkle clean water on them. Then they're going to be saved after that. So it does make absolute sense that we're seeing the restoration of the Jewish people to the land, but as of yet, they haven't had that salvation experience. As we consider to look at the issue of the restoration of Israel, how do these play a role in shaping our understanding of the nation today, but also with the nation in the future? One of the repeated themes that you find throughout the Bible, in the prophets, all the way through into the New Testament, is that there will be a period of divine judgment or trials. Jesus refers to this as the birth pangs period. We also have like the prophet Jeremiah, who refers to it as the time of Jacob's distress. But what you always get whenever that period is mentioned in the Bible, it is then immediately followed in the scriptural, in the text, in the revelation that we have, of a time of great blessing. So it seems to be that there'll be a time of persecution that will then lead into a time of great blessing. And this is actually where the national salvation of Israel happens, and this will lead into the kingdom era. Let me just take you through a few scriptures now that just indicate these periods here. So Isaiah chapter 60 verse 21, it says that then all your people will be righteous, they will possess the land forever, the branch of my planting, the work of my hands, that I may be glorified. So this is one of those passages that speaks about that future time of blessing. You'll find similar passages in Ezekiel 39, in Micah chapter 4, verses 1 to 4. Another verse comes from Amos 9:15. It says, I will plant them on their land, and they will not again be rooted out from their land, which I have given them, says the Lord. So we see this repeated theme of the restoration of Israel to the land, and also looking towards their national redemption. We find this also in the New Testament too. The Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 11, verses 25 to 29, he speaks about this issue too. He tells us that a partial hardening has happened on Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And then he goes on to say, and so all Israel will be saved. Again, pointing towards that time that we refer to as the national salvation of Israel. This was not simply a New Testament invention. This is something that was actually prophesied in the Old Testament, and we see that too. So when we're looking at the restoration promises, or the restoration oracles as they're often referred to throughout the Bible, how do we understand them? How do we understand them in light of an Israel today that is seemingly not a believing nation, not following the Lord, and then also the fact that most of these scriptural promises point towards a redeemed nation? And this is a fascinating question, because it causes the Christian church to wrestle with the question of what about the modern state of Israel today? This is a question that I receive frequently, that I know many people are asking, is what do we do with the modern state of Israel as an unbelieving state? Many people make the claim that there's no connection between biblical Israel and modern Israel. They like to try and create that divide there. And the reason they do that, obviously, is they don't have a view that gives them a future for Israel, but also they just don't see a correlation between the texts that they're reading in the Bible that speak of a redeemed, glorified nation with Israel today. So they go to these other ways that interpret this as being spiritually fulfilled in the church. However, we need to just step back for a minute and look at the whole data of revelation that we get in the scriptures about these returns, this promised restoration that we have. And when we do that, we'll learn some very interesting things, because we look at the flow of biblical revelation, and we see that historically, you can't deny the Jewish people have ancient history in the land. It was the land that was first given to them covenantally in the promises. But then we also have promises that through the judgment of the Lord at certain points in their history, they are going to be dispersed throughout the earth. And whilst they're in this dispersion, they're going to suffer huge persecution from the nations. Let me read to you a few verses from Deuteronomy 28, chapters 64 to 66. It says, moreover, the Lord will scatter you among all peoples, from one end of the earth to the other end of the earth. Among those nations you shall find no rest. There will be no resting place for the sole of your foot, but there the Lord will give you a trembling heart, failing of eyes, and despair of soul. And so your life shall hang in doubt before you, and you will be in dread day and night, and you shall have no assurance of your life. Now that verse provides us with a very good detail of 2,000 years of Jewish history, actually, where they've suffered persecution in the lands where they've been scattered to. And it seemed so unlikely from a secular or a humanistic point of view that they would ever be able to come back into their ancient homeland after being dispersed like that. But when we come to the Bible, we see that this is exactly what the Lord has promised. And this is where the confusion comes, because some people look at most of the scriptures that speak of Israel coming back and they're a redeemed nation and they're following and serving the Lord, but that hasn't happened yet. So we have to dig into these scriptures a little more carefully. And when you do, you find that there is a stage that has to happen before that final consummation. And I believe this is the period of history that we're in now. Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 33 onwards, the Lord speaks about a time where he will bring them back into the land with an outstretched arm and wrath poured out, and he will be king over them. He'll bring them into the wilderness, and he'll enter into judgment with them there face to face to bring them back in to the bond of the covenant. And this is what we see actually happening now. So this is the first inclination that we get from one of the prophets here, that actually there's going to be a restoration in unbelief before that final national salvation of Israel. And as you have that in your mind, you trace it through, particularly the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel 36, verse 24, I will take you from the nations, gather you from all the lands, and give you a heart of flesh. And he goes on, if you read it, Ezekiel 37, all the way through really these passages, you get this staged fulfillment of this restoration prophecy. And it seems to imply that first he's going to bring the nation back into the land, and then he's going to sprinkle clean water on them. Then they're going to be saved after that. So it does make absolute sense that we're seeing the restoration of the Jewish people to the land, but as of yet, they haven't had that salvation experience. Ezekiel 37, the famous valley of dry bones vision, details this. It gives us those stages of restoration. Remember the graphic imagery. First, the bones, which are the whole house of Israel, then the sinew, and then the flesh is put onto them, then the skin. And finally, it says in verses 6 to 10 of Ezekiel 37, then the breath of life is actually breathed onto the house of Israel, which would be indicative of that salvation experience. So we see here clearly a staged progression in the restoration process of the nation of Israel. The dry bones representing Israel throughout the dispersion in exile, and then slowly you see the imagery as they are brought back into the land, and they're made successive waves of immigration fulfill those prophecies. And one day we look to those words like the Apostle Paul said, all Israel will be saved when the Lord breathes the breath of life on them. And this is exactly what we have going on today. Now, we could dig a little further into this and speak specifically about the land of Israel being significant for this. There was debate in the early restoration movement of should they go back to the land or should they go somewhere else? Of course, obviously, it has to be the land of Israel. This is the covenant land. Remember Zechariah 14:4 speaks of the return of Jesus Christ, of the Messiah. In that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in front of Jerusalem to the east. And this is an interesting thing to think about. When the Messiah returns, he's coming back to Jerusalem. But if you read another prophecy, we learn something very important about this. Zechariah 12:10, very famous verse. I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication. So they will look upon him whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as they mourn for an only son. This is universally accepted as the second coming, and it seems to imply that this is actually the salvation moment. The Jewish people look upon Jesus, whom they have pierced. Again, that's how you know this is a second coming passage. And they will mourn. And the word there is giving us the understanding if they're going to repent. This is going to be the event that leads to that national salvation. But let's just jump back a bit and think about this. He's coming back to Jerusalem, and we have here this salvation event. This implies something very important for us to understand about the Jewish people in Jerusalem and the land of Israel at the time of the second coming, and that is what? They're not believers yet, because we've just read that this event is happening in conjunction with the second coming and the Lord pouring the spirit of grace and supplication upon them. So this implies that it is actually an eschatological necessity that we have unbelieving Jewish people in the land and in Jerusalem when the second coming occurs. So all of the restoration promises and the way we understand it has to include a place for unbelieving Israel in the land. And this is exactly what we see today. So when we're looking at the question, is modern Israel connected to biblical Israel? We have to say absolutely it is. It's just a stage in the final progression of the fulfillment, leading to that wonderful day that Paul says will be life from the dead, when all of the Jewish people see Messiah and they accept him. We ask ourselves, do the facts of history, particularly the emergence of a Jewish homeland in the Middle East and the restoration of Jewish people to that homeland, do they tie up sufficiently with the data we see in the Bible that we can form a credible connection and make a definite connection between modern Israel and biblical Israel? And we have to say absolutely they do.